Hi there. Welcome to the Spiritual Embodiment Podcast. I'm your host, Samantha Redondo, a licensed therapist, embodiment coach, and spiritual seeker. And this is a space where we explore where our why meets our what. And today we are diving back in with part two of my spiritual story. And I'm so excited because, if you listen to the last one, I left you on a cliffhanger like any good author would do, any good storyteller is about to get weird. It's about to get real culty. And yeah, I hope if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly encourage it just to get the background and the context for where we're going to go next. But if you're just like wanting to hear the tea on the cult stuff, you're welcome to stay here and go back and listen to context later. You do you. So I left off last time talking about how, I'd really oriented my identity around being good, around being really, really spiritual, really around this formula, this plan that I got given by the church, by this Christian camp, JH Ranch, that I was a part of all through high school and college. And this formula of being really godly, following the rules, like not dating till you're ready to get married, remaining sexually pure until marriage, seeking God about your future career and job, and purpose in life. And a lot of like day to day stuff, like having a daily quiet time and spending time journaling and praying and reading the Bible. I mentioned last time the kind of big bullet points of like, here's the big boxes to check that definitely weren't part of the plan. But there were also messages around like who you hang out with, how you dress, that were kind of more implicit in the plan, but I definitely embodied to a T. And so when I was graduating college, I was getting a degree in theology. I had a lot of experience in pastoral counseling, which I did at a church that I was a part of during that time. I was, like I said last time, getting more into these charismatic churches. So, churches that believed in the gifts of the Holy Spirit, like speaking in tongues and prophecy. And it was really through that church that I was a part of, and those spaces like worship nights, ministry outreach, where we would go out into the public university town and, on a Friday night and pray for people and help get drunk people home safely. And we'd make all these burgers, and the house where we do this at was called Jesus Burgers because all the partiers knew they could come get a free hamburger from the Jesus freaks. So I was involved in that at the end of college and really starting to get into this like charismatic brand of Christianity, this flavor that was like very emotional, very spiritual, very mystical, but a lot about like the physical manifestations of God's presence and power. And so there was a ministry team that came out the spring of my senior year. So, kind of as I'm getting ready to graduate, wrapping up school, figuring out what's next. And they were from this church up in Northern California that I had heard of and like had a little bit of experience with, called Bethel. And Bethel actually has a School of Supernatural Ministry, which, if you listen to my podcast episode with Jubilee, you heard all about both of our experiences there, because I know her from that time. But they essentially like teach you how to do supernatural ministry. And what they mean by this is like using the gifts of the Holy Spirit to do ministry in the world to bring God's kingdom. And honestly, when I met this crew of people, I was perfectly primed. I was hungry for God. I was spiritually seeking. I was bought in about spiritual gifts and feeling a gap, like I mentioned in the last episode, developmentally with a lot of the other kids at my school, where even though they were Christian and good people, they were a little bit more normal. They like good music, non-Christian music, and they were interested in things other than spirituality, and they drank, and they sometimes did drugs, and they sometimes had sex. And even though I thought these people were so cool and they were my friends, I felt like on the outside, I felt like I had built my identity around following the formula, being good, and I couldn't really relate to them. And so when I met this team from Bethel and I saw these kids that had given up, I mean, they were from all over the world and they had given up careers, they had given up family, they had given up, going to college or, fill in the blank to move to this tiny town in Northern California and just give their life to God. And what I mean by that is just like selling everything, giving up all their opportunities they had in their life to just do ministry, to just be a part of the church, to serve that church and that school. And then eventually the hope was you'd be sent out somewhere in the world that this church had connections to either be a pastor or run a ministry or, have some position of influence within this kind of like denomination flavor of churches, if you will. And that was kind of their formula, their path. And so I had been on my own little path, my own little formula, and I still wasn't getting the things that were promised. I still hadn't met my husband. I knew I wanted to do ministry, but I wasn't quite sure what my actual purpose, what that would look like. And so hearing about this school, I was like, oh, I think I need to do that. Like that is what's next for me. And this is an actually spiritual community. Like these are people who get the Holy Spirit. These are people who get what it means to have the gifts. They get what it means to be sold out for God. And I've been at a Christian liberal arts college, but not everyone there is sold out for God. And the truth is, now looking back on it, I was like, my college was actually really well-rounded. And there were lots of really brilliant, intelligent people who were also faithful Christians who knew how to be nuanced and knew how to be normal and live real lives. And I actually now really appreciate that community and the people there. But at the time, I was, like I said, kind of in this process of spiritual disassociation where my whole identity was around spirituality. And I didn't actually know how to sit with the nuance of I can be a human and I can like things that don't have to do with God. And I can listen to non-Christian music and I can, explore my sexuality and I can have these parts of me that are inherently human and still be good. And so that was part of my journey later down the road, but we're not quite there yet in this story. Anyways, I was sold on the whole Bethel thing. I ended up going up there right after school to their first year of the School of Supernatural Ministry. And if you want to hear more of the details of what that was like and the ins and outs of that experience, I highly recommend you listen to my podcast episode with Jubilee on Healedish, because we get into some of the nitty gritty of what happened there, because we both were there at the same time and actually in the same, what was called a revival group, where it was about 50, 60 people with one pastor. So you can listen to that there. But I wanted to keep this kind of as, our 1,000-foot view of my spiritual story, because there's a lot to get through. And so mainly I'll talk about the themes that I experienced during my time at Bethel. I was there for about 5 years. And this is really where for me, it became the formula above all. So this plan of being in ministry, being a godly person, God is everything. We're completely sold out for God. And earthly stuff, normal life stuff doesn't really matter. And the way this school was set up was we were in class, which was essentially a church service 7 days a week. 5 days a week we had school. On Saturday, I was in the healing rooms, which was a place where people from all over the world would come with injuries and illnesses to get prayed for supernatural healing. And then Sunday, I was at 2 to 3 church services. So it was my whole life. And like I said, this church and school exists in this tiny little town in Northern California. And so there's not much to do. If you want to go out on a Friday night and do something fun, you go to Chipotle or Chili's. There's really not much going on in this town. And the people in the town really didn't like Bethel. They didn't like that we were there. We were taking all their jobs. We were taking all their resources. We were praying for them in Walmart. We were annoying. Of course they didn't like us. They're just living their quiet small town life. And then there's this mega church with people coming from all over the world. And they definitely saw it as a cult. And so that was, I think, a really difficult part about being there is like, it actually was hard to just live a normal life. And it made sense that our whole life was around the church because the community didn't actually want us there. And so, I made some really lovely friends during that time. But I think one thing that stands out to me is this idea that those relationships and that sense of belonging that I experienced there was really around shared belief. We were all so bought into the beliefs that Bethel stood for and the messages, and had sold everything, had moved across the country, moved across the world to be there, that relationships felt easy. But I think a lot of that was because some of what existed in this community was this reality of intimacy without trust. And so because people had come from all over, had these shared beliefs, you kind of assumed they were good. You assumed they were trustworthy. You assumed they were godly and just like you. And so, I remember going to coffee with people that I had just met, no context for who they are, and them asking me, what's your testimony? And we were expected to just like share our deepest, most vulnerable parts of us minute one of knowing this person. And like I share in Jubilee's episode, Revival Group was a place too where we expected to be vulnerable, to say the worst thing about us, to share our darkest thought or experience for the sake of vulnerability, for the sake of community and connection, because these are the people who will love you no matter what. And you can't experience true unconditional love until you show us your grossest, worst parts of you. And as someone who has been trying to be good for almost their whole entire life, this was actually really hard for me. I was like, I don't know. I don't have like some big sin story. I don't have some big crazy testimony. But the thing that kind of came out of me was like, oh, I hate myself. Like self-hatred is the thing that I can say is like the worst part of me, which I think is telling because that didn't come from my childhood. That didn't come from trauma. That came from a different kind of trauma. A lot of these church messages telling me I was bad, telling me I was sinful, and that I had to follow this formula to be good. When in reality, I think following the formula is what created that self-hatred, because I wasn't letting myself be myself. I wasn't letting myself find expression. I wasn't curious about my own development. And my parents, weren't that curious about my development. They just wanted me to be good and follow the rules, to have a happy, successful life in their view. So, it's really like a catch-22 and a mind fuck of like the thing that was my worst part about me, my biggest, darkest secret, was self-hatred. And actually the environment I was in created that self-hatred. And so at the time I couldn't see it, but looking back on my process, I'm like, wow, there was so much cognitive dissonance there for me to think that, this community, this church, this place could heal this thing that it actually created, which was hating myself, and being disconnected from myself and my true spirituality. So, a big part of this environment too was, serving certain leaders in order to get influence and power. And so there was a lot of messages around like, pick a leader who you want what they have. You want their gifts, you want their anointing, you want their position, and like you serve them. And maybe one day God will bless you with what they have. And so there was a lot of, these people came from all over the world and wanted to be in ministry. So there was a lot of competition, a lot of comparison, a lot of like positioning for power, even though no one would ever say that, right? And so in that, it kind of opened the door for a lot of manipulation, spiritual and emotional manipulation by leaders, because they were pretty much saying, hey, if you do what I tell you to do, you'll get everything you want. God will bless you. And so this was a time that I really experienced the most like spiritual abuse and emotional manipulation from leaders, because I was just so bought in. And I think that's the thing, is we all were sold out. I think the people who were questioning, were critical thinking. Like they left day one. We were all the people that were like, no, this is, this is God. This is good. These people have my best intention in mind. I trust them. God trusts them, so I trust them. Just so many ways that we made sense of what was going on that were just false assumptions, that were just, lies and manipulation. And so this time too, for me, was less on following the rules in the sense that like I had been motivated to before, and more about following the herd. So, what was expected of me? What did it look like to be good and spiritual in this environment? And, maybe some of the other rules could be bent, like drinking, because I had a pastor who drank and like took us out to a bar, and that's okay. But sleeping with my boyfriend, not okay. So there were still these like really hard and fast rules, but it was kind of under the guise of freedoms. Freedom was a big value. We talked about it all the time. Like God gives us freedom. And so I think there were certain things like exploring your style and like dressing in a way that was really cool and fun. Drinking, maybe like smoking a cigarette or smoking a little pot, like that kind of stuff was like, ooh, you're edgy and that makes you relatable. Like you can go hang out with sinners. Jesus hung out with sinners. And so you can go do that too. But then there were hard and fast, like, but you can't be gay, but you can't have sex before marriage. If you do, you get put on a purity plan. Like just, it actually was like so much cognitive dissonance, like it didn't make sense. But I was so good at learning what are the rules here, what's expected of me, what's the formula. Okay, I'm going to do it. So I was pretty bought in and sold out for 2 years. And then my third year, I worked for a pastor who was just a narcissist, very selfish, very self-centered, definitely had a lot of narcissistic behaviors. And I was also going through a time of personal struggle where my mom was going through some health issues. And so I was flying back and forth from Southern California to visit her, to be with her through surgeries, to take care of her. And really wanting, in this environment of so much emotional and spiritual intimacy with our leadership, I was looking to this pastor to be a support, to hold space for me, to be an encourager. And he was not. He literally told me, I don't have capacity for your stuff. Like I'm going through my own stuff and I can't hold space for you, essentially. And so being dropped in that way, feeling like emotionally like, wow, I've kind of given my life to this person. I'm at their beck and call. I'm doing everything they want so that maybe one day I can, be promoted like they've been promoted. God will bless me. To feel so kind of like emotionally abandoned and dropped by him, the cracks started to show through this year. And I think working for him, I started to see like he was a pretty prominent leader because his parents were prominent leaders in the church. And so he, kind of some nepotism, like didn't really earn his spot, but people were like, oh, like, yeah, he can do outreach. He can do college ministry. Like, sure. And I started to see behind the curtain of his process, of his lifestyle, of other leaders that he was friends with and how they lived their lives. And me being someone who like my whole life had been so good, who had followed the formula, I was like, these are the people who are in leadership. Like I started to see the man behind the curtain and I was like a little judgmental, honestly, a little self-righteous of like, I like am better than these people. I can, I had a theology degree at this point. A lot of these people didn't go to college. They didn't go to a like accredited school to study the Bible, and they were preaching and in these like massive positions of leadership. And, it started to rub me the wrong way of like, I feel like I'm more qualified. I'm more intelligent. I'm, actually like better as far as like following the formula than these people. And yet they have power and I don't. And this was something that had rubbed me the wrong way in other churches of like, man, if I had just been born a man, I could be a pastor, but I'm a woman. So I have to just do women's and children's ministry. And it always bugged me when I felt qualified and motivated to lead. Like I really wanted to be in a position of leadership, but I felt like I saw all the guys around me getting the opportunities and I kept getting looked over. So this was another one of those that kind of was a straw that broke the camel's back, where I was like, oh, I actually feel disrespected by this person. I feel like I'm being used to do busy work, to be the emotional space holder for his process, in ways that were highly inappropriate. And I actually am more qualified to be in ministry and be in leadership and to preach than he is. And so I remember I went home for a week, and this trip coincided with a ministry trip down to Southern California that this pastor and our whole team was going to go on. And so I went home a little early to see my family. I was going to do the conference with them that he was preaching at and then fly home on my own. And so I was already at a point where I was starting to feel that cognitive dissonance of like all the things that I had been told to be successful in this environment I was doing, and it wasn't working. And I was actually seeing like this person who got power, who got a position, is a piece of shit. And I'm so much better than them. I'm such a better candidate. And yet, like, no one can see that. What am I missing? So I also was starting to have like panic attacks and anxiety and just like overall not being okay. So I was still going to meetings, I was still showing up. I was pushing back in small ways, not in a way that would be like directly called out, but like in a way that I'm like, you can't fuck with me. And so I go home, I'm at my parents' house, and I'm telling my dad kind of about some of my experiences, some of my thoughts lately. And so he's kind of thinking about it and like being a dad, like, I don't like that this guy's like disrespecting you. I don't like that you have all these qualifications and no one's seeing that. Like, I did pay for your 4-year education of undergrad, like to be equipped to do ministry. What the heck? He's feeling some of that injustice for me too. And then we do this event, this ministry event. My parents were really involved in Christian ministry where they lived too. So they had set up like host families for our whole team to stay with. They set up like a dinner the night before the conference. They set up all these special things that my mom worked really hard on and like pulled on all her community and resources to set up. So this pastor speaks at the conference, we do ministry, and then my mom had planned like this whole beach day the next day and all this fun stuff we were going to do, and this like dinner for the team to really honor all the work we've done this year. And he was like, oh, you know what? My friend called me and he wants to surf. So I'm just going to leave and drive an hour and go hang out with him. And I'm going to take like half the team with me. And my parents were like really offended. They felt really disrespected, felt like they kind of saw his narcissism and saw that like he didn't care how he impacted people. He just wanted to essentially get paid from the conference and then leave and go have fun. And my dad was like, you are not working for this person anymore. Like, he was just like so livid. And up until this point, they had seen Bethel as like a really good place. And I think that they started seeing the cracks then too, of like, maybe this place isn't as good as we thought it was. I was seeing those, so I was telling them what I was seeing, and they're like, okay, this might not be the best place for you then. So that kind of started the disillusionment from that version of church. Pretty much when we got back, I immediately got a concussion and couldn't go to meetings or church services anymore, which at the time I thought was like God giving me a way out, which really, in hindsight, like, my body finds a way to give me a way out when I've been in a situation where I feel trapped. And I don't think I like intentionally got a concussion, but I do think it was a really convenient and timely moment and excuse that I had to not go to church, to not go to meetings, and to pretty much, with 3 months left of my contract, say like, hey, I'm done. I can't do my work anymore, so I guess I'm done. And one of the reasons I didn't want to just flat out quit was I still was holding on to, this can be the place where I have my career. And there were other pastors that were in my life, not who I was working for, but who I had a relationship with, that I was like, well, maybe this person will give me a job, or maybe I could see an open door here. So I didn't want to throw away, the last 3 years just because of this one person who kind of was shitty. So I ended up staying for a few more years, trying to make it work. But that season, it's like my eyes were opened. I kept seeing the corruption and the manipulation, just the people who had power, who had no responsibility and no right to have any of that power. I started to see, some of the messages that were really harmful. And I also just started to see the people. And I think at this point, I was done with the school, but I was volunteering with the young adults ministry. And I was on the prayer team. So people would come up after the service and ask me for prayer for, whatever in their life they wanted prayer for. And I just started to see like, wow, there's so much trauma and anxiety and depression. Like I just kept hearing that over and over. And I think I was recognizing that I was also dealing with anxiety. And even when I would start to go to services after my concussion healed, I had panic attacks every time, which I think was a result of the trauma I experienced working for this leader and how just stuck and manipulated I felt. And just another way that my body was telling me, this is not a good environment, you need to leave. And so because I was having these experiences of mental health crisis and not being okay, when I would hear these people come up to me and telling me about their anxiety, about their panic, about their depression and their trauma, and all I had was, I can pray for you, it just felt like not enough. It just felt like, what are we doing? And so this was the beginning really of my spiritual deconstruction as well, of really questioning the church I was in, the things I was believing, the things I had literally given my life to, left everything to be there. But it took me a good 2 years of unraveling that. And a big part of my deconstruction was entering a deep depression, feeling like I had given my life to something for really the past 10 years, because since high school, I was volunteering at JH Ranch in the summers, the Christian camp I was a part of. I was serving at my local church and college campus ministries while I was at school. And then I had the 5 years at Bethel. And so I really felt like at this point, the formula has failed me. Like I have followed this formula most of my life to a T. I can't really think of any times I have like strayed from the path, and this is what I get. Like I get disrespected, I get manipulated, I get, doing all this work for no pay, and I'm not getting job offers. I'm not getting positions of power. I just got really angry. And I got angry at God. And I was like, God, I feel like you have killed all my dreams. I feel like I have followed the plan. I have followed the path, the formula, and none of it has panned out. And in that moment, I felt like I heard the Holy Spirit, who I was like accustomed to hearing messages from in my mind, say, then throw a fucking funeral. And, think about that what you will, but it really felt like a message from Spirit. And even if it's just like from my subconscious, it broke something for me where I, for the first time, felt freedom to not play by the rules, to not follow the formula, to say, okay, I feel like you've killed all my dreams. Now you want me to throw a funeral? Cool, I'll do it. And I remember this was like, I think the first spell I ever did, like getting a piece of paper, writing all my dreams on it, all the things that I thought the formula would give me, the husband, the ministry career, the family, the happy life. And I burned it. And I let myself feel the grief. I let myself feel like someone had literally passed. And, I was already pretty depressed, but I think this was one of the most cathartic parts of that depression, was actually letting myself grieve the loss of this life that I thought I wanted, this formula that I have followed to a T for so many years, not actually giving me the things, not actually panning out. And really in that grief, I was also grieving the version of me that I didn't get to be, all the developmental stages that I missed, all the parts of me that were suppressed, that were oppressed, that were shut down and disconnected from. And so kind of my last year there, I started slowly exploring, slowly, thinking about like, what if I just dated and it's not my husband? What if I just went on a date with someone I thought was cute? What if I started exploring my sexuality? And I remember like asking my roommate at the time about masturbation and like, what is this like? How do you do this? Because it was so shut down and had like never even thought about that stuff. And this was also when I kind of like started exploring trauma work and somatic work and, ordering a ton of books about trauma and recovery and really getting interested in therapy and like found a therapist during this time. And I think one of the big turning points in this time for me too, I was still at Bethel. I was still living in Reading. I was still volunteering, but most of my life was pretty separate from the church. Like I wasn't going to weekend services anymore. I was working for like a fashion company virtually, which actually was really fun and life-giving. And it was cool that I got to do it from my tiny town because it was online and kind of the beginning of work from home jobs. And so the summer before, I had been on a trip with a girlfriend who I worked at JH Ranch with, and she brought one of her best friends out who I'd never met before. And we like did this little tour around California because they were from the East Coast, and it was so much fun. We had a blast. And so this friend of a friend, her name's Christy, we actually kept in touch and just, hit it off on the trip and would chat every once in a while. And so we were on the phone one time and she was just like, hey, your job is virtual, right? And I was like, yeah, like I work from home, I can work from anywhere. And she was like, okay, mine is too. Like, I just went on this cruise with my parents to Europe and like did some work while I was there. And it was like really fun. And I was thinking like, how cool would it be to come back for like a month and just live in Europe, like for part of the summer, next summer, and like maybe go with a girlfriend. But she's like, I couldn't think of any of my friends who actually could do that except for you. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. I never thought about doing that, but I'm not doing much here. Like my life at this point was kind of boring and small. And I was like, I don't have much going for me. So what the hell? Let's do it. And so we went to Europe for a month, a little over a month in the summer, worked a little bit, traveled around to different countries. And it was like the first time that I had just like thrown the formula out and just been like, I'm just going to be free. I'm just going to be me. And where I was coming from was not a very free place. So I don't want you to think this was like a rumspringa and I like did all the crazy things. I like fantasized about doing all the crazy things, but like at this point, I still had never kissed a boy. I still like, was so shut down sexually and barely partied at all. So a lot of it was just like drinking really good wine, eating really good food, throwing on cute outfits and going to different places, having little crushes on, people who worked at our hotels in Italy or Spain, but like nothing major happened. But I think the biggest thing was I just allowed myself to be on that trip. I just allowed myself to explore and express. And I found that little bit of freedom outside of that Bethel environment for the first time and really understood. Once I got back from that trip, I was like, yeah, I can't stay here. And I think I only lived in Reading for 2 more months and then moved home. So moving home wasn't like this big freedom celebration. It definitely felt good to leave. And my best friend and roommate at the time, Victoria, who I hope to have a guest on this podcast, but she was kind of in a similar season as me where we were, both disillusioned with Bethel, both felt like it was time to leave and like told each other within the same week, like we're both leaving. And so I think we moved within a day of each other. She moved back to Nashville. I moved down to Southern California, and moving home was the best and worst thing I could have done. One, I felt like all my old coping mechanisms from childhood came out. I had to kind of renegotiate my relationship with my parents and figure out, I feel so developmentally behind. What does this mean about you guys? What does it mean about how you raised me? I feel like I've been lied to my whole life. So I'm going through deconstruction while also navigating like their part, their role in my spiritual life. And they lived in this really lovely home on this like nature preserve. And so, my mom's an excellent cook. And so we had really good food. I like walked with our dogs in the preserve every day. I had my work from home job. I got to go to the beach. I got to see old friends. It was a really lonely and difficult season, but it was also like so healing and restful. And I think a big part of that time for me too was starting to do somatic work and starting to go to therapy and understand what happened to me, how I'm making sense of it, actually like working through and processing the trauma, letting myself grieve, letting myself feel, and starting to put the pieces of my story together that I felt so like jumbled and like out of order for so long. And so I think the biggest thing too that was really hard was like I was just so directionless. Like I was pretty depressed and I didn't know where I was going to go from here. And so parts of this season for me was like this reorienting to my spirituality. So whereas before spirituality had been the end all be all, it had been all consuming, it had been the whole kind of like driver of my life. I wasn't going to church. I had no interest in being in a church. I was pretty disconnected from all of my friends because I left the community. I had Victoria because she also left. But other than that, like besides the random comments on Instagram, I really didn't have much connection with any of them. And I had a lot of questions. I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of despair and I had a lot of grief. And I think I didn't trust how I had done my spirituality up until that point because I felt like I had been so deceived and so wrong ending up at Bethel and being there for so long that I didn't really trust like the way that I heard God. I didn't really trust my gifts. I didn't really trust my own knowing because my knowing had been so off. And so I kind of just got back to nature, got back to the simple things, moving my body, intuitive eating, going in bodies of water, like floating in the ocean, kind of the things that felt meaningful and grounding about Europe. I just brought those into my daily life at my parents'. And, they were really concerned about me and tried to help me in different ways. And one of the ways my dad helped me was, he noticed the books that I ordered about trauma and therapy. And he knew I was kind of learning more about therapy and doing my own work. And, he's like, hey, you're really intelligent. You're highly educated. Like, would you ever consider going back to school? And I was kind of like, I mean, I just went to this school. I know it's not like accredited but like I feel like all I've done is be in school. I kind of just want to work and do something normal. And he's like, yeah, I get it, but also like I could see you like loving grad school and loving higher education because he has a PhD and is a scientist. And so I feel like we're similar in that way where we really like thinking deeply and research and writing papers. And so, he saw that in me and kind of put that thought in my head. And I was like, okay, yeah, like I don't think that's it, but I'm open to it. And then my mom, who is the master connector, knew I was interested in therapy. It was a desire of mine, like right after college, but I ended up going to Bethel at that point instead. And so she kind of connected me with some folks at their church who were marriage and family therapists. And so I got coffee with them and they invited me to a lecture that a professor was putting on. And I was reluctant to go because it was at the church, but it was like a side room. It wasn't the main sanctuary and it was about therapy. So I was like, okay, this is church adjacent, but it's not church. So I'll go. I ended up going and sitting next to a lovely woman named Brooke, who's one of my dear friends now, who is a psychologist. And, we learned about this therapy technique and we practiced some of it. And I was like, wow, this is so similar to some of the like inner healing work and pastoral counseling I've done in the past that I like really loved doing. And it also feels like I kind of got to use my gifts for the first time since Bethel in a way that felt like normal, in a way that where people were like, wow, you're really good at this. And I was like, thank you. This feels good and it's helping people and it's addressing like trauma and anxiety and depression and all these things that I felt like the church wasn't addressing, wasn't helping people with. And then the other woman that I sat next to, Sharon, was, I didn't know at the time, but the wife of the professor who gave the lecture. And so I was just kind of like getting to know them, and we're doing these little practices together and have no idea who she is. And she's like, "So are you a therapist?" And I was like, "Oh no, like I'm not, like I just came from the recommendation of a friend and I'm just interested." And she's like, "Oh, well, you should apply to school. Like you should apply where my husband teaches." And I was like, uh, what? That's your husband? Oh my gosh, like this is crazy. She's like, "Yeah, you need like," and my friend Brooke was like, yeah, we see it. Like you need to be a therapist. Like this is, you are so skilled. You're so good at this. You're perfect for it. Like what's stopping you?" And I was like, I mean, literally nothing. Like I don't have anything going on in my life right now. I'm literally living at home with my parents in my mid-20s. Like nothing's going on. And so she was like, "All right, the deadline's in 2 weeks, but if you can figure out how to take the test and apply, get your application in, email me." And yeah, I think you should do it. And so I kind of left in this whirlwind of like, holy shit, what's going on? Am I going to be a therapist? I thought therapists were just like old guys in cardigans. Like, what does that even mean? Like, I'm just kind of starting therapy myself. Like, I just had like no clue. And so I went home. I told my dad about it. He was like, "Yeah, this is what I've been saying. Like, I think this would be a really good fit for you. Obviously, with all your like pastoral experience, it makes sense. And it's like that higher education piece that I think you're really good at and like really appreciate." And so I was like, okay, well, I might as well just do my application. I remember like taking the GRE with like no studying and passing it in like a really high percentile. And I was like, what is happening? Like, it just felt like things fell into place. And I was still depressed. And I was still like, I don't know what I'm doing, directionless, grieving. And so I got into school for the following fall. I spent that summer just kind of like getting ready and looking for an apartment in LA. And also was like reconnecting with a friend from undergrad who was doing some like house church things, but was also very normal. And she lived in LA and had gone to the school that I was going to go to for a different degree. But so I started reconnecting with her and her friends, and things just kind of fell into place from there, where grad school ended up being a time of massive deconstruction for me, where I kind of learned a new way of seeing humanity, of seeing spirituality, of seeing, you know, my role, my career, my purpose, and so much healing too, as I was doing my own therapeutic work during that time while I was learning about therapy. People were kind of amazed that I was doing both at the same time. And I was like, this is who I am. I'm an intense person and I'm just going to do it all the way. And so I kind of took that chutzpah, that drive from how I just dove in headfirst into spirituality, into therapy, you know, just like learning everything I could about it, doing my own healing. And there were a lot of ways that like the grad school program I was a part of, you know, some of the power dynamics were still there that I had experienced in the church, but it gave me what I like to call with clients a petri dish. So like a similar enough experience to our trauma where we're activated, where there's a little bit of a trigger, where we're like, ooh, this reminds me of that. Holy shit. And I was safe enough still and supported enough with the friends I made in grad school, with my therapist, to work through the trigger, to work through the charge and the survival activation of my body, to really heal those parts of me that had experienced spiritual abuse, that had been manipulated and controlled and shut down and disempowered for so long. And so grad school really felt like my crucible, my incubator for deconstruction work and reconstruction work, where I really started to explore like, what is spirituality for me now? What does spiritual practice look like? Do I want to go to church? Do I not want to go to church? Ended up more not, but finding community, finding friends outside of church, outside of those communities where we all had to believe the same thing. And then I also got a part-time job at an outdoor company that I have like always loved. And I felt like that was connecting back to my outdoorsy self, my nature loving self. And that is the space where I ended up meeting my husband too. And so, my first big serious relationship was the person I ended up marrying. And I remember thinking when we were dating, like, he's just so normal. And after dating so many guys in the church and especially in this culty place, I just so appreciated someone who it was easy to be with, who like we had a really great friendship because of being coworkers, and we enjoyed a lot of the same hobbies and interests and things like that. And who like I was attracted to. And a lot of that exploration for me sexually did happen with him, which is so fun. Now that we're in a committed relationship and we get to continue exploring that together. So that season really was one of just reorientation, recalibration, and reconstruction of kind of now building my own version of spirituality. That's not just this formula that someone had given me or this list of rules or expectations, but was connected into my true self, into my body, into my, own felt sense of spirit, of God, of nature, of meaning and purpose. And I think some of the things that really now are a big part of my spirituality that I appreciate are just coming back to nature and community. Those are like the grounding forces in my spirituality now, that it's not about a belief system or a set of doctrines, but it's really about where is the community and how are we grounding into nature. And whether that's through the work that I do leading community workshops, or it's through hanging out, going on a walk with a friend in the woods, or swimming in the ocean with my family, like that, those spaces are the ones where I feel the most connected to myself and the most connected to the more than human world. Embodiment is a big part of my spirituality now, of just like, that is how I access my wisdom. And I'm sure I'll go more into that in this podcast, but that is the way in for me, is doing embodiment practice, doing movement practice, also meditation and prayer. That's something that I'm like exploring more recently, of like, how does prayer fit in to my spirituality now? It's something that I've always loved, I've always appreciated, and I kind of like left it by the wayside for a while because it did feel like a part of that damaging version of spirituality that I had been a part of for so long. So I'm reintegrating it now, and it feels really helpful. Also ritual. So like, what are spiritual rituals that feel embodied and good to me, that feel authentic to me in this season? Meaning making. What are systems and structures and ways, even like philosophical questions that help me to make sense of what's going on in the world right now and what's going on with me right now. And then just the relational aspect. So seeing spirituality through the lens of relationship, that whether it's spirit, whether it's nature, whether it's community, like, how am I relating? How am I showing up? How am I building trust? How am I being vulnerable and creating intimacy? Those relational principles really help ground me when it comes to spirituality, from keeping it too rule-based or too legalistic, bringing it back to that relationship like I talked about in those early years for me, that where relationship with friends, with family, with God just felt easy. And I know it's more complicated in adulthood, but I'm trying to find that ease of relationship, of trust and intimacy in all of those relationships now, especially the spiritual ones. So that is my brief, big picture spiritual autobiography. I hope you enjoyed listening, and maybe you connected to pieces of it. Maybe it was interesting for you to hear about dynamics within the Christian church or within spirituality that you hadn't ever heard about before. Or maybe you are very familiar with those dynamics and it might have brought up some feelings for you. I am so excited in future episodes to talk about what reconstruction looks like. I kind of brushed over that last part there, but it's because I want to talk more about it in detail. How to rebuild after spiritual trauma, how to rebuild after that disillusionment of, what the fuck have I believed? What have I been a part of? This is not in alignment for me anymore. This is not feeling good anymore. This is a sham? How do we move forward? How do we make sense of that? And so that's definitely something I'm going to share more in future weeks. So stick around and follow along as we jump more into that. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Spiritual Embodiment Podcast. I'm Sam Redondo, and I'll see you next time.